Thanks for plugging in with Rethinking the Dollar. Click the subscribe button below for more great interviews to come. Enjoy my conversation with James Turk. Thank you. Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have James Turk. Mr. Turk has over 40 years of experience in international banking, finance, and investing. He began his career at Chase Manhattan Bank, where he worked on various assignments in countries such as Thailand, the Philippines, and Hong Kong. And in 2001, he co-founded Gold Money, which is a precious metals dealer and storage that does work internationally. I guess not only provides commentary, analysis, and speaks at conferences, but he also is an author. And today I wanted to invite him on to discuss one of his two books, and we'll probably get to both books, but the one that I thought was most relevant for what's going on is The Collapse of the Dollar and How to Profit from It. Mr. Turk, welcome, or James, I'm sorry, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. How you doing?
Good, Mike. Thanks a lot.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. I had your other co-author, Mr. Rubino, on a couple weeks ago. We had a great conversation about the money bubble, and I know that lots changed since you wrote your first book, The Dollar Collapse. And so I wanted to get into that, and we can definitely transition to the money bubble because there's a lot of things that tie into that. But without further ado, wanted to ask you a question first. When you hear the words rethinking the dollar, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Very important thing to do because we've lost sight of not only what the dollar is, but even what money is. You know, money is central to society. It's what enables us to interact with one another in a way that, you know, we can improve our situation. You know, that's how society works. We work, we save money, we go into the marketplace, to use a generic term, and interact with other people. And other people are doing the same thing that we're doing. You know, they've worked, they've saved up some money, they go into the marketplace in order to fulfill their needs and fulfill their wants. And they use money as this means of communication with other people in order to create this exchange. And because everybody improves their situation by interacting with one another, our society continues to advance and we continue to improve our standards of living. So money plays a very, very critical role. And what's happened is that we've lost sight as to what money is. You know, money is a tangible asset. It's not some piece of credit. It's not an IOU. And when I think of rethinking the dollar, you know, I think back to the problems that the framers of the Constitution had when they formed the Constitution. You know, the War of Independence, there was the first currency of the country was called the Continental. And the Continental collapsed in a hyperinflationary blow-off, just like the Deutschmark did the Reichsmark did in Germany in the 1920s, or more recently, like Zimbabwe did several years ago, or what's happening now in Venezuela with the collapse of that currency. You know, when a currency is backed by nothing except government promises, it tends to be destroyed, and that's what happened with the Continental. And unfortunately, the dollar is on the same path. So as part of this rethinking of the dollar, we have to look at what money is in its broadest sense, but also think back to the problems that the country had at the very beginning, what the framers of the Constitution wanted to accomplish, and was pretty much in place until 1971 when everything changed.
Right, right. Good explanation there. Now, how important is it for the public to understand the current global situation that we're in? We're going to get into the dollar collapse. And so just before we get to that actual concept of collapse, how important is it from an educational standpoint for the public to be aware of this?
Yeah, you know, you really have to look in a global way these days. You can't really look in a provincial, short-sighted way. You know, we all are part of a global community, and money that we use is part of a global community. And as a consequence, we have to look at the interaction of how the dollar is versus other things as well as other monies. You know, and of course the precious metals as well, which is how the dollar used to be defined up until 1971. But the point I'm making here is that, you know, we live in a global community. It's becoming increasingly clear. You know, the fact that, you know, you're in the States, I'm over here in London, is an indication of how global we've become because of communication and computer technology. And money has a key role to play, regardless whether you spend it at the local store or spend it on a vacation or spend it by purchasing some good from a merchant over in Asia.
All right. Now, in your opinion, how come this subject hasn't been something that has just been taught in the school system? Like, I know for a fact here in America, I actually calculated, I'm capable, and I actually went through approximately 19,000 hours of actual in-class structured learning, and other than maybe a little bit in economics, a little bit in political science, never really came across the subject of money from a practical use as far as day-to-day transactions, savings, learning, just basic budgeting, things like that. So why do you think that that's not prevalent in our education system? I assume it's the same there in London as well.
Yeah, well, I was educated in the States as well.
Yeah.
I was born not too far from where you are at the moment. I was born in Ohio.
Yeah.
And I didn't learn about money in school either. I learned, as it turned out, most of my basic concepts as a young boy from my parents. But when I went to school, I sort of forgot, what they had taught me, and learned some crazy economic theories when I was in university. And when I graduated from college in the late 1960s, I saw things happening around me, and it just didn't make sense. And it brought back the memories of things that I had learned as a young boy from my parents. And when it comes to money, the most important thing is really just common sense. And it requires something, just think about it. And we have a situation today, for example, what's called negative interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of earning a fair rate of interest when you lend money, say, for example, to the Swiss government or to many different governments around the world, they're actually taking money away from your capital. People are accepting that, but logically it doesn't make sense because that's not how our capitalist system works. That's destroying capital, that's not building capital. So you have to look at crazy things that happen out there. Try to divorce yourself from the emotional aspects and just look at things logically. And if you look at the world today logically, there are a lot of crazy things going on.
Right. Now, to get into your book, originally written in 2004, and it looks like you guys, altered the title slightly, but other than that, it still deals around the collapse of the dollar. And so, to get into that, what made you first come up with that title, and how did all that arrive?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things. First of all, money and banking, that's been my career. That's where I focused my career, over 45, almost 50 years of it now. And I had been writing. I'd written a newsletter. Had written a lot of articles before that. And John Rubino and I, my friend John Rubino, who's a co-author, got together and said, look, there are a couple of major opportunities here. And we wrote about those. And the book was first published as The Coming Collapse of the Dollar, but when the paperback came out a few years later, it was called The Collapse of the Dollar because the publisher said, well, the dollar's already collapsed. When you look at it relative to the price of gold.
Yeah.
Because the two things that we recommended in there were, one is buy gold because it was undervalued, and secondly, bet against the housing bubble. Now, the book first came out in 2004, and we were, maybe 2 or 3 years a little bit early on the housing bubble. And, gold started picking up not too long after we wrote the book. So, maybe we were a little bit early, but it did give people time to, read the book and think about it and see whether it made sense to them.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as that book, when you first wrote it and the concept was introduced in your circle, how was it received amongst the banking, the finance, and investing world? Well, was there some backlash, or was there a praise for it, or how did that come about?
It was interesting. The general mainstream, I think, largely ignored it, although the book did become a bestseller over time as the gold price started rising and as we started moving toward the housing bubble collapse. So it was, I guess, initially a mixed review, but that was pretty much to be expected because we were talking about things that you weren't hearing in the mainstream press. You were hearing in the mainstream press how housing prices never went down, instead of what we were saying, which was that the way housing prices had risen had all the earmarkings of a typical financial bubble.
Right. Now, since first writing that book or it being released and becoming a bestseller, how much and what are some of the things that's changed drastically in the last, say, or it was 8 or 11 or so years, in between that time frame there? What's some of the things that's changed drastically that's really egged on the concept of collapse, and especially relating to the dollar?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, first of all, the dollar is heading toward the cliff. You can't predict when it's going to go over the cliff because circumstances change, but as long as it keeps heading in that direction, and you can't predict the speed either, but as long as it keeps heading toward that cliff, it's going to go over the cliff. And that was basically the theme, of the coming collapse of the dollar. And the gold price did rise dramatically and housing prices did fall dramatically. what's changed since then is that the dollar is still heading toward that cliff. It hasn't yet gone over, but we have more problems today than we did back in 2008. We have a much bigger level of debt today than you had back in 2008. We had a much bigger level of derivatives today than you had back in 2008. So, the consequence of it is that you can defer the reconciliation of all of these debts, but you can't avoid it. At the end of the day, a debt has to be repaid by the borrower. He pays the money back to whoever he loaned him the money, or the debt has to be repaid by the lender, in the sense that the debt is a bad debt, it gets written off, and never gets repaid. And we're at the stage now. I thought it was going to happen in 2008, and we were close, but it didn't quite happen. We're at the stage now where these debts have to be reconciled. And typically, when you're in a monetary environment like we have today, where the money can come off in any quantity off a government's printing press, the currency tends to get destroyed. That's how the debts get repaid. You repay the debt with a currency that's basically worthless. That's what happened in Zimbabwe. That's what's happening now in Venezuela. That's what happened in the 1920s with the German Reichsmark. And that's what happened in the 1780s when the Continental inflated, and any debts that were denominated in the Continental essentially were repaid with the worthless currency. So when we talk about the coming collapse of the dollar, what we're talking about is that, sure, if you own a $10,000 T-bill, that the U.S. government owes you $10,000, they'll pay you $10,000, but you're going to get a lot less purchasing power back than of the purchasing power you gave them when you bought that $10,000 bill.
Right. So the actual collapse or the cliff you're referring to is actually the currency itself basically not being able to purchase anything because all confidence is gone because it does nothing for the person using it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a very good point, because you get the collapse of the purchasing power, and you mentioned about the confidence in it. When you talk about confidence in a currency, you're talking about the demand for that currency. We talk about supply and demand on a lot of different things, but we don't normally talk about it on money. But money, just like any other good or service, has a supply and demand. And what happens is when confidence in the currency declines, demand for that currency declines. If you have a declining demand, that means that currency becomes worth less and less and less. And that's where you have the collapse of the currency. So it's really people losing faith in the currency, and that's why it's impossible to predict too, because you don't know when the tipping point is going to be reached. But I think we're very, very close, because if you look around the world, asset prices that are rising, they're not rising because of good economic conditions. The stock market's not going up because of good economic conditions. There are more people. Put it this way: there are less people working now in the United States, or more people unemployed now in the United States than there were back in 2007. Mm-hmm. The stock market's going up just simply because of all of this money printing by the Federal Reserve, and same thing with stock markets around the world, because all central banks around the world are printing money left and right like there's no tomorrow. So all of these things are contributing to a loss in confidence in the currency. And what people are doing is they're recognizing that there are two types of wealth. You have tangible wealth, things like farmland, mines, timberland, gold, silver, and then you have financial wealth, things like bank deposits, insurance policies, government bonds, and things of the nature. And then you have something in the middle called near tangibles, and that's where the stock market comes in. Mm-hmm. If you own shares in Exxon, it's basically you own a claim to all of the assets that Exxon owns, including all of the oil wells and everything else. So it's like a near tangible. So the stock market is going up because people would rather own tangibles or near tangibles than they would own financial assets like bank deposits, anything with a counterparty risk. And that's typically what you see in the early days leading up to a currency collapse. People logically respond to what's happening in the market and take those steps to protect themselves.
Okay. Now, in part one of your book is broken down to a 4-part series. Part one is why the dollar will collapse. And you mentioned that all fiat currencies fail. Can you explain what that means and how important it is for people to understand today that all currencies fail?
Yeah. First of all, the term fiat is it's a Latin term, and it means, essentially by force. In other words, the currency that's used today, the U.S. dollar, does not circulate because of its inherent value, as it did when it was tied to gold or redeemable into gold. It circulates because of government law. But that doesn't mean it has to continue circulating if people lose confidence in that currency. And what we've seen over time is that when you don't have some external discipline on the amount of currency that can be created, the government prints too much of it. And when they print too much of it, the ultimate result is that the currency loses purchasing power, people lose confidence in it, and ultimately the currency collapses. So if you look throughout monetary history, whenever a currency was based on government promises rather than tied into a precious metal, the currency always collapsed. And the dollar has been floating for a while, not being tied into, formally tied to gold. And I think we're reaching the extreme where we're probably very, very close to the end of this era of fiat currencies, the end of the era of this fiat dollar. And hopefully we'll go back to what worked for the first 175, 180 years of the country, which is money tied to physical gold and physical silver.
Right. Now, along with currency, for the most part, our currency is not necessarily linked or backed by what it used to be in the form of metals. And so now it's backed by treasuries. And so how does that relate to our national debt? Since you first wrote the book and back in the day, I think we were single digits, 7, 8, 9 trillion national debt. Now, today we're, 18, touching 19, and who knows where it's going to go from there. So what's the relation between the national debt and currencies?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, there is a relationship. It's a direct relationship, but it's not an obvious relationship. So sometimes the relationship is not necessarily seen. Mm-hmm. But what happens is that a government wants to spend money, and if it's constrained as to how much money it has, it can only, like people, we can only spend what we have. Well, a government can spend not only what it has, but it can spend more than what it has in the sense that it will borrow. Now, if it keeps borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, eventually the market says, I don't want to lend any more money to the government because it's becoming too big of a risk, or the interest rate isn't high enough, for whatever reason. So what the government then does is they still want to spend the money. So they take the debt and they give it to the central bank, or in the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve and the banking system, and they say, take this debt and give me currency so I can spend it. So you have this direct relationship between the growth in the federal debt and this growth in the total quantity of dollars that are circulating as currency. And when that growth is greater than the new wealth being created, it's an indication that the debt cannot be serviced by the new wealth that's being created, and that's when you ultimately see the destruction of the currency. Again, it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over a period of years, or in the case of the United States, it's happening over a period of decades. So it's very easy to be lulled into complacency and say, just because it didn't happen last year or 2 years ago, it's not going to happen the next year or the year after that. That's not the attitude to take. The attitude to take is look at what's happened in monetary history and assume that, and not assume, just say that you can't predict the future because nobody can, right, but prepare for a collapse of the currency and take those steps necessary to be prepared.
Okay, so we're talking about currency. So we have an idea of what currency is, and so in part 2 of your book, you mentioned about money then and money now. So the question is, what is money? Like, what is money in a historical aspect? What is the money to a lay person, inner city, middle class, lower class family that just receives a paycheck and some digits in their computer that says I have X amount of dollars, and they do transactions off their debit card, things like that. Is that money? Yeah. Is that, what is money?
That's currency. That's not money. Money and currency are two different things, mm-hmm, conceptually. You have to recognize that goods and services pay for goods and services. In other words, when you're born into the world, you can't just automatically borrow money and go out and buy something. You have to start working and you have to start saving. And when you're doing that, you're basically creating goods and services and effectively buying the goods and services that you want or you need. But what we do in terms of this interaction is we actually use currency to bring that all about. So money is essentially a tangible asset. Currency is what we use from day to day in various transactions. So because we're in this crazy period of time, we talk about the dollar being money, but it's not really money in the historical sense. It's only a money substitute circulating in place of gold and silver.
Okay, so gold and silver is the answer. Now, in part 3 of your book, you mentioned why gold will soar. And so clearly you've given us the difference between currency and money, money being metals historically.
Yep.
And so in the times we're in now, with all the global economic and geopolitical events happening now, China, Russia, they're purchasing gold in mass amounts. And here in America, especially, in my area, pretty much on every corner, every mile, there's a We Buy Gold shop. And so people are exchanging their gold because they need cash. Exchange your gold for cash. How will this play out in the years to come with those who have gold and those who don't have gold or silver when this cliff or collapse happens?
Yeah, a couple of good questions there. Let's first deal about the bit about cash for gold and these various shops. Gold is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Money. You can do two things with money. You can spend it or you can save it. So if you have something that's gold that you've been saving or has been handed down to you from your parents, and you're in a tough time because of economic conditions or some family circumstances or perhaps an illness in the family, you may end up taking that gold and selling it and getting cash and then using that currency in order to fulfill some specific need that you require. So it shows that gold still does today what it's always done throughout history, and it has a 5,000-year history. It's a form of money. But the question you ask about, well, how will this all unfold? It's a little bit difficult you can't really predict it. But what you have to do is you have to look at monetary history. Gold has this 5,000-year history, as does silver, as being used as money. And here we are the last 40 years, since 1971, when President Nixon broke the formal link between the dollar and gold. We have this 40-year period. In most lifetimes, 40 years is half of a lifetime. It's people's working adult lifetime. So it seems like a long time, but it's just an eye blink. It's just an eye blink in history compared to gold. Right. So we have to again, just looking at it logically, we have to assume that when this crazy period of fiat currency comes to a conclusion, gold and silver will reassert themselves in some kind of central role to society.
Right. Now, it wouldn't be ideal. We've talked about the problems. Now, the subtitle, the collapse of the dollar and how to profit from it. And so we know gold and silver being money. Ideally, go get some gold, go get some silver type of thing. But in the back of the book, you mentioned a couple other alternative ways at diversifying and things like that. So thinking about, your middle class worker, lower class worker, someone with a couple dollars left over after the cost of living, how can the person get involved and do some things to prepare and to better, be in a better position, with money and currency and things like that?
Okay. Well, I'm not an expert on personal finance, right. But I will make a couple of comments that I think are sort of logical.
Right.
When you're a young guy getting started in life, and particularly if you're married, and particularly if you have kids, the first thing you have to focus on is having a house, some kind of a shelter, so that this is where you and your family can live. That's number one priority. As part of that, though, you want to. If you have a mortgage on it, the sooner you pay off the mortgage, the better, because then you own that piece of property free and clear. That's yours to live in and enjoy your life in. But as part of that, as you're accumulating wealth, as you get older, and you're starting to think about old age and retiring and things like that, you have to start developing your savings and your portfolio. Now today, it doesn't really make sense to save money in a bank because you're not earning any interest on that, and you've got a lot of risks associated with the bank. So what I recommend is, instead of saving dollars, you save money. In other words, you accumulate gold or you accumulate silver, and you just continue accumulating, and that becomes your savings. So once you have a savings built up, then you can start going even further into building your portfolio by going into investments of different sorts. And this is where again, I'm getting out of the area of my expertise. I'm not a personal financial advisor, but there are a lot of opportunities out there in investments, everything ranging from buying things like property to buying, as we were discussing just a few minutes ago, about equities, shares of different companies. So I think that's the way you should really be building up your portfolio and thinking about it. And there's an important point that relates to this. We think in terms of dollars when we calculate prices of goods or services, but I was actually born and raised not too far from you in Cleveland, Ohio. And I remember as a young boy growing up in the 1950s that my parents could drive the family car into the local gas station and fill up the car with $2 silver, which were still in circulation, back then. And today, $2, it doesn't even buy you a gallon of gasoline, let alone fill up the car. But if you took the silver content of those $2 silver, you could still fill up the family car with gasoline. So what you have to do is to really measure your portfolio, and whether you're actually accumulating wealth or just treading water or perhaps even losing purchasing power, you have to calculate not only in terms of dollars, but calculate in terms of ounces, because ounces are really the measure of purchasing power, and purchasing power is what you want to really increase as you accumulate your portfolio.
Wow, calculating according to ounces, that's I like that right there. Now, since this book, The Collapse of the Dollar, How to Profit From, was written, you and Mr. Rubino have teamed up to write another book called The Money Bubble. And so I read the book, great book. I think it picks up kind of where this book left off, and as far as the bubble aspect of things. So let's touch base on that a little bit. And so one question I asked Mr. Rubino was, mainstream media talks about the economic recovery. I wanted to get your take on the economic recovery we're currently in now.
I don't see any economic recovery. I really don't. Not in the United States, not in Europe over here where I live.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of cheerleading going on in the media and a lot of wishful thinking, but the economy depends on people working. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is they're not showing a growing number of unemployment. They're showing a decline in what's called the participation of the workforce. Mm-hmm. And it's declining to levels we haven't seen for decades. In other words, the percentage of people working today are much is as low as it's been decades ago. And as a consequence, until you get people working and interacting in the economy, you're going to have a sluggish economy. So I really don't see much economic progress. It's at best a very halted, slow growth, and we've just seen now that the first quarter U.S. GDP numbers were released, and again, they're showing that the economy is just barely keeping its head above water.
Now, with the release of the GDP numbers, I noticed that there's always an initial release of what the numbers are, and then down the line there's some adjustments. How do you, I guess, screw it up that bad where you have to make some type of drastic reductions, because usually decreases down the line? How is that? Has that always been that way?
Yeah, it's a good observation. Well, it hasn't always been that way, but it's been that way for a few decades now. When private forecasting or forecasting by private economists has been sidelined relative to government calculations of numbers, and like so many things today in the United States and other countries, they become politicized. So they'll put something out that's an estimate, and then that's the good news, and then the bad news comes when they do the revisions 2, 3, 6 months later on.
Yeah, when everything dies down a little bit.
Now, yeah, it's a sign of the times.
Now, the money bubble. Now, how did you come up with that idea, the name Money Bubble, and what brought about that?
Well, as I've already explained a little bit, we were in a crazy period of time, mm-hmm. and when you have these crazy periods, they typically refer to as bubbles. So, for example, back in the late 1990s, during the internet bubble, people would say things like, well, profits don't matter, only market share does. And when that bubble popped, everybody realized that the conventional wisdom was incorrect, and basically went back to basics. And then the same thing with the real estate bubble. everybody said housing prices only go up. And then after that bubble popped and housing prices actually started declining, people realized with the benefit of hindsight that the conventional wisdom during the bubble was incorrect. Now we're in a money bubble, and the conventional wisdom is that the dollar and the euro and the British pound and all these other paper currencies are money, when in fact they're only a money substitute circulating in place of money. And when this bubble pops, people once again understand that, yeah, gold's been money for 5,000 years, silver's been money for 5,000 years for a reason. That they create a level playing field so everybody can interact with one another in society in a way that is fair to all of the participants.
Right. Now, with these bubbles that's been inflated, it all due to the interest rates. And so, being that for the last 8 year or several years now, okay, think offhand, we've been near zero. How has that played into this bubble creation, and also what's your take on the subprime lending based upon those interest rates?
Yeah. First of all, the subprime lending is just a sign that banks are struggling to try to make more money than they're already making, particularly in this zero interest rate environment. But this zero interest rate environment is really quite significant. We really have to think this thing through. The only reason why interest rates are at 0% is not to try to jumpstart the economy. It's to try to make governments around the world look solvent when in fact they're not. And I'll use the US government as an example. We have over $18 trillion of debt now in the United States. That's just the direct debt. That doesn't include any of the contingent liabilities, unfunded pensions and things like that, which are estimated to be another 100 trillion. But 18 trillion of debt. Now, if interest rates went up 1%, that's $180 billion a year of additional interest expense that the government would have to pay. So let's assume they're paying a fair rate of interest, like 5% or 6%. You're talking about an additional $1 trillion of spending that the government would have to spend just on interest expense to service its debt obligations. Now, if it had that kind of a burden, it's not going to reduce spending in other areas to pay interest on the debt. So what it's going to do, it's going to increase its spending by $1 trillion, meaning it has to borrow more money, meaning interest rates are going to rise, which means that next year the additional interest expense may not be 1 trillion, but 1.5 trillion. And that's how you eventually get a hyperinflationary blow-off and a currency collapse like the ones we've been discussing earlier. The debt just becomes unserviceable. The debt is already unserviceable, but because interest rates are zero and they're not paying any interest, the government's not paying any interest on its borrowing, it makes it appear to be solvent, but reality is it's not solvent, which is something that we all have to consider, and we have to take that into consideration in terms of our personal planning. The couple pillars that made the United States really great was that self-reliance. People were reliant on themselves, and you had a level playing field where everybody was treated equally under the law. Those are the pillars of a great society. And what's happening now is that we don't have a level playing field anymore. This is why you see the animosity between the 99% and the 1%. The general population recognizes that they're being taken advantage of. And the way you take advantage of people, history has shown, is you get control of the money system. Because if you can control the money, you control the economy. And if you control the economy, you can control people. And that's what governments want to do.
Right. So in your opinion, will there be any increase slightly in the interest rates anytime soon this year, as many people are saying, or they can't do it? Or what do you think?
Well, they're going to try to keep interest rates at zero, but the market is eventually going to rebel against it, because you can't just keep lending money at zero interest rates, or here in Europe at negative interest rates, because that's ultimately destroying capital. Mm-hmm. So it's let's say it's postponed or deferred. The dollar going over the cliff that we talked about a little bit earlier, but it hasn't changed the direction. It hasn't put the dollar, turned it around in the right direction. So they just bought more time, but sadly they're not doing anything to correct the problems. They're just continuing to spend and borrow, and that's not the way to go.
Right. Okay. Well, coming down the home stretch, one thing, the whole idea of me coming up with rethinking the dollar concept was to educate the uninformed. And so from your standpoint, I mean, you've been in the industry, so you've been working hands-on for the last 40 plus years. And so for your average middle class, low class, lay person who has no concept of, personal finance, nevertheless monetary, history or things like that, what would be some simple ways or some starter ways for someone to get involved, get informed, and, basically begin to take action? What type
Yeah.
of books or recommendations would you give someone if they came to you looking for advice on how to get informed?
Yeah. Uh, First thing would be, education, and I think you're doing a brilliant job with your website.
Thank you.
And as part of that education, look at other websites, start reading books, talking to people whose views you respect, or even if you don't respect them, in order to sort of see both sides of the equation. And all of that's necessary to help educate yourself, because it's really at the end of the day education that's the key thing. That's what everybody has to have a good grasp on in order to improve their situation in life. And that's what we all want to do. We all want to have a better situation for ourselves and for our kids. And education is a key element to that. Then you have to start focusing on, saving money, working and saving money, production and savings. That's the key way to get ahead. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. There's a website called Mises.org that talks a lot about sound money and various basic principles. And there are a lot of other sites too as well in terms of personal financial planning and steps that you have to take in order to build up a portfolio. But it all comes down to this, Mike. We all want to be able to sleep well at night. And the way we do that is being prepared for an uncertain future, because we live in a world that cannot be predicted. And one of the key elements always comes down to having some gold, having some silver, because they've withstood the test of time, regardless what happens to the economy, regardless what happens to the monetary situation.
Well, James Turk, thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insight. How can the audience, those that might see this video, get in touch or get involved with what you have going on? Where can they find you at?
Yeah, my company is called goldmoney.com. We're based over here in Europe, but we've got 22,000 customers around the world. And we're storing for them over about $1.3 billion worth of gold and silver in different vaults around the world. So if you're interested in accumulating some gold or silver, buying gold and silver and storing it safely in different locations, take a look at goldmoney.com. And the other thing, of course, Mike, is I'm very proud of this last book that John Rubino and I wrote, The Money Bubble, What to Do Before It Pops. It's available on Amazon. It's only a few bucks, and it's very informative. And I do think, people will find it a very helpful book to read as they go through the process of learning about how the money system really works.
Right. I do agree. Read both books and definitely opened my eyes to a lot of things. So once again, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to staying in contact with you.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Me too. And perhaps we can do this again in the not too distant future.
Definitely.
That concludes my interview with James Turk. I want to encourage you to get a copy of his book, The Collapse of the Dollar, as well as his latest release, The Money Bubble. Definitely two books that would help improve your monetary literacy. And also visit Rethinking the Dollar, where there I have a chance for you to test your money IQ. And also you can get a copy of my free ebook, The Simplicity of Money, the 4 money lessons you will never learn in school. And also get a chance to connect with me on Facebook. Give me a thumbs up. On Facebook, I share a lot of monetary news and things that's relevant to the dollar happening globally. Other than that, I'll see you soon.